Hello, hello.
Hey folks. Quick sound check for me. Is my mic really blustery or is it okay?
Sounds good to me.
Okay, great. Yeah, I tried to
I,
position the fan so it's not blowing at the mic.
that's good. Yeah, it's really
Hello, friends.
good.
I think it's just a small crew of us today, so we can probably just get going. Um, let's do a quick. Oh, good. Okay, we've got a full set of folks. Um, just to kick things off for the sake of posterity for our recording, let's do a quick round of names and faces, and then we'll jump into our agenda. Hello, everybody. My name is Lee. Benji, you're up.
Thanks, I've lost the agenda. Hello everyone, I'm Benji.
Hey Benoit from Apollo.
Oh, Martin from Apollo. Mark, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi, Mark from Yelp.
Awesome, welcome, y'all. It's always a good part of the reason why we do it is in case anybody is new, which for this career is not the case, or for our recordings, which is helpful. But also, it's always a great AV check to make sure everyone's got the agenda and their microphone works. Okay, I'm just reading over quickly everything we have to dig through today. We've got some editorial changes on error propagation, removing fragment spread name from visited fragments. I'm interested to hear about that. Service capabilities, syntax, and then two agenda items on schema coordinates on not including ignored and seeing if we have anything else left. I might propose actually that we dig into the schema coordinates first, just because we have sort of two tightly scoped things right there. And I'm excited to get that one across the finish line if everybody's okay with lifting those up to the top of the agenda. Cool. All right. Martina and Mark, I'll let you all lead us in.
Mark, do you want to take this one?
Yes, it can do that. Sorry, I'm just in between things, but I'm good now. So yeah, I spoke to Benji kind of in the interim, and he pointed out that I'm sorry, I'm trying to bring up the PR 1 second.
So the main thing I pointed out was that the the white space being allowed in schema coordinates could be quite problematic for many of the ways in which we're intending for them to be used. So if we're intending to use them for things like counters and tracking and telemetry, then having spaces in that string means that we can't guarantee the string's uniqueness. And that uniqueness is actually one of the key properties of schema coordinates. We could always parse it and then print it back out again without, but that just seems unnecessarily complex. And we don't see a huge amount of value in allowing white space. Back to you, Mark.
Yep, that's pretty much it. So the change that we made, or that we proposed, is to remove that. And I think on the implementation, I'm still trying to find the GraphQL JS PR there. But basically to kind of give it like a different, like a different Lexa class to, not look at white space, and then the spec as well kind of has a note for that. So that's basically the change there, which I think is very much a good change in the spirit of schema coordinates of they're unique. So yeah, it makes a ton of sense. I think that should be a pretty slam dunk one. And then do you want to get onto the secondary item about kind of like in the spec about not including ignored, or should we just kind of focus on the first item?
Sorry, are there two items? What do you mean the two items?
There is, oh yeah, sorry, there's this other, maybe this is sort of implementation detail, but there's this other PR that we have around, there was just a question of like where we should talk about this in the spec, and we had like a draft edit. And
I see.
Like confidence to where to put this. So I think maybe we should talk about that a little bit as well.
Yeah, okay. I'm quite encouraged by the motivation for this. The idea that if we're saying a schema coordinate is unique, if the grammar helps us guarantee that uniqueness via like the literal string of the thing being unique, that does seem quite useful. I don't think the proposed change is the right way to do it. Actually, I think it highlights something that we kind of overlooked here, which is a schema coordinate is really its own grammar. It's its own language. It's not like a piece of GraphQL in the same way that, if you're like adding some extension to GraphQL, then it would be assumed that all of our white spacing rules, like you wouldn't ask the question, can you put a comment in this? It's like, yeah, it's part of the GraphQL grammar. You can put comments in GraphQL, so of course you can. But the fact that we're asking, like, should you be able to put a comment in the middle of a schema coordinate? And we're like, seems probably not, is probably indicating that, like, this is actually its own grammar. And it's totally fine for it to be part of the GraphQL spec. But I think probably the change we want to make is just like tweaking the way that we describe the grammar to, instead of like referring back to the base tokens, like have its own expression of a set of tokens. Like it can be its own self-contained grammar. And then there would be no ignored, and it would just work.
On the implementation side, if it's its own grammar and its own set of tokens and its own kind of like separate like parse function, everything's sort of like completely separate from the rest of the GraphQL thing, which I think when I was like initially like 5 years ago or 10 years ago, whatever it was coming into this, kind of like how I imagined this would all work. Because I didn't want to like infect the main GraphQL, parsing stuff. And it seems like we've come full circle, and maybe that's the right decision after all. So just to clarify, I think that essentially implies like a full revert and doing the GraphQL JS implementation again, if I'm kind of understanding this correctly, which I have no problem with. Completely understand what you're saying. I just want to make sure we're on the same page.
I think so. it also, my sense is that the GraphQL.js change will be quite straightforward because it'll be like removing complexity and it'll keep it tightly isolated, which will probably also be quite nice from like a reusability point of view. That if you like just need to do schema coordinate parsing, then you have like a very tightly defined function that's not going to like do other stuff. And my sense is actually it will result in like net removed lines from the spec change. Like it'll just everything can be contained within this schema coordinate section. Um, because right now there's a lot of like there already is a little bit of infection out because you had to do the dot versus the triple dot disambiguation, which we'll probably ultimately need again in the future. I would not be surprised if we have a dot operator and we'll like look back at this draft and pull in this exact copy because it's the right way to add a dot punctuator. But if we have our own like lexical grammar for schema coordinates, then it's just done. It'll just work. Um, and then we don't need to have this like extra change to the core GraphQL syntax.
All right. And then follow-up question. One of the things that we talked about, and I guess was unclear if this was blocking moving forward or not, was the idea that there's like a dot get schema coordinate, function, whatever, on the AST nodes, and then that would maybe kind of be consumed by error messages, but also certainly by like frameworks, like inside a resolver wanting to call that to log something or whatever, which I think makes sense. So then we would have we would just have like we would keep that method and we'll call into this thing. Okay. I guess that wasn't really a question. I was just
Yeah.
there.
Yeah,
Okay.
I think that makes sense.
All right. I think
So
that
I have a little bit of pushback, as is my want. So first of all, like, what would this, if we did it as a separate grammar, what would this mean for things like Appendix B, the grammar summary? Like, would it need its own grammar summary? Would we be renaming Appendix B to like GraphQL document grammar syntax summary, sorry, and then have a separate one? Which, I mean, honestly, we don't need another appendix for the schema chords, but if we're calling this grammar summary, it feels like it should cover all the grammars in the spec, not just the document one. And secondly, what does it mean for name? Name is like the main token that we use in obviously GraphQL and also in the schema coordinates. Would we just define it a new one, like a schema coordinate name in terms of the other name one, or would we need to keep them in sync if we allowed extra characters in future, or what would be the plan there?
I think we could just reuse it. I think there's no reason why, like you could think of this as like there are just two grammars being defined in the same source file, and so they can refer to the same function called, the parse name, which is probably literally exactly how it will work in GraphQL.js as well. That doesn't seem problematic. And name is also a lexical rule, right? There's this like double colon for a lexical rule and a single colon for a grammar rule. And that one's already a lexical token. So I think like the primary thing that we do up front is describe when parsing GraphQL, we like describe the rules of these are tokens, these are ignores, and like here's how you parse an interleaving of ignored tokens and semantic tokens. And tokens just happens to be a list of stuff, and one of them is punctuator. But punctuator, I don't think it's actually referred to anywhere else in the grammar. It's just purely there to say a punctuator is a valid token. And then later on, we just like literally refer to the the specific characters. So I think probably what it means is just like a much, much, much shorter version of that same sort of clause where we introduce schema coordinates and say a schema coordinate is its own grammar. Here's the set of tokens it uses. it uses name and it uses schema coordinate punctuation, which is dot, the parens, colon, and the at sign. And that's it. It has no ignored tokens. And therefore, and then that gives us an opportunity and a space to describe like the string value of a schema coordinate will always be unique because there is no ignored tokens. Every single character is meaningful in a schema coordinate.
Yeah, that seems reasonable to me.
I'm happy to help co-draft Mark if you wanna have any help on getting that part done.
So in GraphQL JS, I wasn't super happy with this. We subclassed the Lexer and basically gave it a handle ignored method, which the default one would do nothing, and the schema coordinate one would throw. So we're essentially proposing here that we would have a separate entire
Lexer.
implementation of the Lexer. Okay.
Yeah. Which hopefully wouldn't be too bad because most of what the Lexer does at its core is just goes through a tight loop of figuring out what's the next character and therefore like what Lex pattern should I do, which is basically it's almost entirely the punctuation Lexer followed by like if it's not a punctuation, it's probably a name and like go into name. So then parse name can be fully recycled as is, and the punctuation parser just, has 4 or 5 items in it instead of a dozen, some of which are complicated. There's no string values to parse here since schema coordinates don't have strings. Like most of the complicated Lex tokens are not in schema coordinates. So
yeah, it definitely seems like it would be a lot simpler parser. So I can see the value in that. Also means from a GraphQL JS point of view, if we go ESM, which we're discussing, you can import just that bit, and you only have a tiny little thing to put in your bundle. So yeah, I'm in general support.
Good from a tree staking point of view, also good from like a resiliency point of view, because you can imagine like some tweak to the Lexer that supports some other GraphQL feature, like accidentally breaking some schema coordinate thing. And if we make it its own Lexer, that's just far less likely to happen. Cool. Mark, what's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'm just kind of like taking it in and just thinking back to the GraphQL JS implementation bit. I think that's probably, tempting as it is to like try and share that Lex code, probably just copy and paste a bunch of stuff, maybe. It'd be simpler.
I think you should be able to fully recycle parse name function, and then everything else can be, copy pasted basically.
Right. That stuff probably scares me less than the spec changes that need to be made. I feel like I always have like a general idea of like the spec changes need to be made, and then Benji kind of comes and helps finesse it a little bit.
I'm happy to take a crack at the spec change edition. Because if you're feeling more confident about the JS change and I'm feeling more confident about what the spec change will look like, I can put that up as like a PRT or PR so you can take a look.
Okay. Yeah, I'm technically still on vacation, so I'll get back to this in probably like a few days.
Yeah, no worries.
But yeah, okay. I mean, yeah, I think overall it probably makes sense for the long term. So cool. And then I'm assuming this, as anxious as we all were for this to be kind of included in the like spec cut release, I'm assuming this sort of implies that we probably won't make it for the spec cut.
Not necessarily. I'm still working on the spec cut, and we've got the last pieces of one of to get into. So,
okay. I mean, if it makes it great. If not,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. All right. Anyone have anything further on this?
I think the other thing was just a question of if there's anything else to do. I think no.
Okay. Yeah, at least like the core like syntax of schema coordinates is agreed upon now, which is huge. So Cool. All right. Well, yeah. Thanks, everyone. I'm gonna drop back off now.
I didn't realize you were on vacation. Thanks for joining us. I see now in your reflection that you're somewhere that looks really nice, so you should go enjoy that.
Cheers. All right. Thanks,
Hey,
everyone.
Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
All right.
Bye.
Props to Mark for joining a working group call from what looked like a tropical vacation.
The sound of birds were nice.
Well, now I'm glad that we went through schema coordinates first, so that he didn't have to sit and listen to us talk about things that weren't his primary thing. Okay, well, we can pop back in the order that we have for everything else. Benji, I'm super curious to hear about error propagation editorial change.
This was fun. I misread the spec for years, it seems. And I always was under the impression that essentially you could have at most one error related to any field that resolved to be null. But that's not the case. Actually, any field within that can add to the errors, and then ultimately the nullable is where it stops at. But of course, it won't capture from any nullable positions inside of it, which is why I never hit it before. Only captures from the non-nulls, so they can effectively add to the errors list. Now, what this means, and the way that it's implemented in GraphQL.js, is that there is a execution context, and that has an errors list on it. And when an error happens, we capture it and we add it to the list. Then, when we execute a GraphQL request, we return that errors list as part of the response body, which then means if one of our non-nullables has blown up and has bubbled, and another non-nullable has exploded next to it as well, but does so, let's say 2 seconds later, we might have already sent that initial response as a result. The GraphQL has finished resolving, and then we're still writing this error into that same errors array. So after we've given someone a result and we've said, hey, here's your data and here's the one error that happened, when they later read that list, it might suddenly have 2 errors, which is fun. So that's easy to resolve. Like, we can just slice the array when we return the result. But it does raise a bigger issue with the way that I've been thinking about the throw on error behavior. And essentially, one of the key aims behind the throw on error behavior is that it essentially what it wants to do is to reproduce the error propagation that happened on the server side on the client side, so that it would give you the same kind of behavior. But what I was doing before in the throw on error project was I was reading the null later would have been overridden by the one that actually exploded. So this isn't really the one that caused the failure of that field. Like an error that happens on a nullable field isn't the cause of that entire thing being null. It would never be. But what we actually want to do is we want to throw the error that came from a non-nullable field. Now, if we have access to the schema, we can figure that out for ourselves and find the first error that matches that behavior. If we don't have the schema, as is in the case of, let's say, window.fetch, then now we don't know which one of those we should be throwing. And especially because we can continue adding to errors after the thing is bubbled, we have this issue where we don't know which error to throw. We can't give you the same equivalence as what you would have had on the server side. So here's my proposal. We specifically add a small change to the spec that essentially says that after the error has propagated, no other errors from sibling fields or from their descendants can further be added to that array. So essentially we have like a little per level flag that says this has already been exploded, don't add anything else. That is essentially the proposal. This is definitely RFC 0. This is a straw man. This does not have a GraphQL JS implementation. This is more I wanted to open it up to discussion. One of the things that's actually quite this as well is this only matters for old style null propagation. For the new style, where we turn off error propagation, this isn't a concern at all. So this is like a transitionary and historical thing, and it could just be a quirk that we allow. But because it has this weird behavior in GraphQL JS where it writes to something after the response has been sent, I feel like it is at least worth discussing. And I would like to see it fixed. So yeah, open the floor to comments.
It's almost like we should be having a conversation about changing the behavior of null propagation so that we can better manage errors. Actually, I'm less bothered by there being multiple errors underneath. It is true that you would then have to say, like, well, then on the client side, what error should I throw? And could throw the first one. You could throw an aggregate one, like JavaScript has added tools now where you can have like error reason that can have multiple errors. So you can have like chains and trees of errors. Those all seem viable, but it does seem not crazy to say that like you did a parallel execution, because we in the spec say that it's okay to do parallel execution, where fields A and B are both non-null and both failed, and so both of them propagated up, and now this root node has become null, and it is factually true that there were 2 errors encountered during that execution. Now, maybe that like field C was delayed for some reason, never got started, probably would have errored as well, but like got canceled for performance reasons as soon as A or B failed. And that's just like a server-side implementation detail. That seems fine. But I would be cautious about saying like as soon as one error has been added, then you stop, because it might not actually even be possible to do that cleanly without like going back and inspecting the error thing to see first, because like if you've actually done parallel execution, then you might not have the information to know about whether or not that's true.
Well, you need to have the way of resolving the data. So I think you would have the way of resolving the errors in the same way, essentially. Maybe not. Yeah, I mean, you could be right. One of the things that I wanted to that I forgot to mention here is essentially this would still allow multiple errors at the same position, but the difference would be we would effectively, where in the spec we say you may cancel the execution, that would stay, but we would also then say, but any errors thrown should, and this is the important thing, this I've only proposed this as a should, not a must, should not be added to the errors array. So essentially, if it is possible for you to capture it and to know this, you shouldn't add it to the errors list. And that way we know the very last error that happened that matches the path that leads to a null is the non-nullable error that caused that thing to explode.
But is it? I mean, it's just a matter of like timing. If like field A and B have highly variable timing, they're both highly likely to fail. The first query, A fails instantly and B takes a second before it fails. And then the second query, B fails instantly and A takes a second before it fails. Then you'll get this like non-deterministic behavior where
yeah, that's fine. That's already the case. We already have that, right? Because you can cancel the other field. So that doesn't matter. If both A and B are non-nullable, I don't care which one of them I get. I'll throw either and it will be the same as what it would have happened on.
yeah, okay, maybe I'm
What
just
I don't want is the nullable field errors. That's the critical thing. So with this should, it basically means the last one is guaranteed to have come from a non-nullable position if it's not the field itself.
I might have to read this more carefully to fully understand.
Yeah, it was quite subtle. But essentially, it all falls back to the idea of whatever was the thing that caused the field to blow up, that's the error. And I don't care if A and B both would cause that, then I don't care which one of them I throw. What I
I
don't
see.
want to do is throw C, which is from a nullable field, because that would never have caused this to blow up. Like C is expected to potentially have an error. That's why it's nullable. So this isn't one that should be rethrown.
Oh, I see, I see. Okay, so you've got a nullable field and a non-nullable field next to each other. Both of them fail. The non-nullable one propagates, the other one does not propagate. However, it doesn't matter because once the propagation has occurred, then the entire object has been replaced with null. And now you want to know which error is the appropriate one to throw.
Yeah, which one caused that thing to explode?
Yeah.
And from a nullable field, that error would never do that. But from a non-nullable, it could. And I don't care which of the non-nullables, just any of them.
Yeah. There's there's a handful of ways that we could address this. One of them is to for an error which propagates, include both the path, its position where it originated, and then the position where it like settled. So you have sort of two paths. Because if you have the sort of like I got propagated up to this spot and this is the place where it got replaced with null, then you'll have both the information about where the error originated from, which is important to preserve, but also and then which field if I accessed from if you wanted to do, throw on error semantics, which field when accessed should result in throwing this error. Um, that would be interesting. Because I'm nervous about saying, you once an error occurs with this particular property, then you like can't add to the errors array anymore. Because it
Shouldn't.
seems hard, shouldn't. But even with the shouldn't, it seems with parallel processing that it would be hard to enforce. And if it's hard to enforce, then it probably just won't happen. And if it won't happen, then we won't be able to build tools that rely on it.
Yeah, I guess it very much depends on how your GraphQL engine is built.
Yeah. Um, this is also like a bit of an aside here, but maybe it's worth kind of reminding ourselves of why we did this air propagation thing in the first place. It's this idea that because I think for throw on error semantics or for like the world in which we have error bubbling disabled, we still need like a solid way to solve this very real product engineering problem of like I've asked for some model. There's properties on that model which should never be null. And if they are null, it's not just an error to access them, it's actually an error to access anything in that object. Like this entire object is now unsafe to read, right? Like if you've got a user object and that user object doesn't have an ID property, certainly it would be quite reasonable to say like if I do user.id, it should throw. But you may want to say, actually, like if you do user.anything, it should throw, or just accessing that user, it will throw. Like that is now no longer an object that is safe to operate on. Anyway, we
I
could debate
feel,
whether that's a reasonable thing to do, but that was the original motivation for this sort of behavior.
yeah, and I feel like that's if the schema felt that that was 100% unsafe, then it just shouldn't serve that data in the first place. It should serve user null. And if it's not that, then and it's the client that feels it's unsafe, then it's the client's responsibility to handle that. Or in the new paradigm, it's the client's responsibility to handle that at the
This
fragment level.
very small history story. This is literally the scenario in which motivated this addition to GraphQL very early on, which was the iOS engineers building the Facebook newsfeed were trying to write their code in a modular way, and they wanted to be able to say, if a newsfeed story gets returned and somewhere deep in resolving some part of its attachment, some error occurs, we don't want to represent a user's story in a partial way that misrepresents the thing that they posted, and it's better to just not show it at all. Which means if you're like, you can imagine like a React component tree in your head, you're drawing all these things, you actually want the equivalent of, which didn't exist at the time on the iOS land, like an error boundary to say like this is a thing which if any error occurs anywhere while rendering it, I just want to hide it and then make sure that you have the kind of error on throw semantics within. That did not exist, so they were writing this like very non-modular code where they would go through every field they could think of which might be null that shouldn't be null to check that it is, and if so, throw the whole thing out. Um, and the idea was like, oh, we can solve this for you. We'll just do this on the server. Maybe that was the original sin, but anyhow, that's the backstory of why we are here. I think we probably need some guidance on how to help product engineers who are using GraphQL through that kind of problem, because I think it's always the iOS folks. Yeah. Where's your error boundaries, iOS crew? Does the Swift UI do this for you now? Surely it must.
So just to round this topic off, one of the other things in this, and I'm happy to pull this out as a separate pull request, I probably should have done so, is that I've renamed response position to execution position, and also reworked the definition of response position. And the reason for that is you would expect a response position, given its name, to be a position that exists in the response, and it isn't, right? Or it isn't always. A response position is a position at which an error can be thrown. So in the response, it may never exist because the null might chop it off. So by calling it an execution position, we actually better describe this as a position that was reached during execution. So it could be a field, it could be a list position, but it's one of those places, and it has a path, and then that path is what's referenced later. And I think that significantly clarifies what a response position / execution position actually is. I think it makes a lot more sense.
I'm actually less excited about this change, because I'm not sure I agree that it makes more sense. Because there's like a lot of things that you could pin on of what it means to be an execution position. Like, should an execution position, because we resolve out the aliases and we actually execute the field, like we've talked before many years ago about doing like normalized responses and using the field name and like unique representation of the arguments provided to like canonically represent a field such that you could do a normalized um, response. Or like, do you include the fact that you were branching through fragments along the way? That's part of the execution path. So I think there's a lot of things that occur during execution that you would reasonably ask the question of, how do I get this from an execution position or path? Whereas it is true that because of air bubbling, a response position could be deeper than what actually exists in the response. Like, but the response position, the intent of it at least was to be clear that it is spoken in terms of response keys, response paths, and this like response object that gets built to try to be as specific as possible about what that is. But it is true, and it is certainly worth calling out that if you have air bubbling, then it is totally possible that you have an error which has a response position which is deeper than what actually exists in the response because of that error propagation. It's sort of like there's a ghost part of the response that you didn't get to see, which we actually did like probably prepare and threw away. Didn't get included in your response.
Okay. Well, even without the rename, at the moment it says a response position is a uniquely identifiable position in the response data produced by execution.
Yeah,
And
that's not quite
not
accurate, is
true.
it? Yeah. Yeah, that's not quite accurate.
So I do have edits here for that. So if we just revert the execution position, response position, keep response position, but describe it in terms of the position reached during execution, maybe that would come out through the response. I'm not sure on 100% on what the wording should be there. Oh, actually, I said I put is a uniquely identifiable position in the response structure evaluated during execution.
Yeah, that's maybe a little heady, but I think is more accurate than what we had before. So something like that seems like it could be a nice editorial clarification. Um, I think actually probably the important part is worth the most important part you have here is just this like note that you've added that
Yeah.
that position might not actually be in the result due to error propagation. And that's, I think, like the original definition is 99% true. It's just like literally saying it is a position in the response is wrong. It's like it is a position in the response unless this error propagation has happened. And that's probably a super reasonable thing to do an editorial clarification of and get merged.
Okay, cool. I'll break that out. I'll rename execution position back to response position, and we can discuss the should later, maybe based on what the different implementations feel the execution of it would be. So your concern at the moment, just to summarize, is it may be challenging to even do this because of the parallel nature of execution of GraphQL. So if we have, say, GraphQL.js, GraphQL Java, GraphQL.net all manage to do it fairly easily, would you be in general support of it, or would you still be hesitant?
I think mostly in support of it. Yeah, I'm trying to think like anytime we remove information, I'm always a little nervous because I'm thinking like who might be relying on that information? What value does that information have? Because it's always a bit of a trade-off. Like having that extra error there now makes it ambiguous as to which error was responsible for that failure. Um, but it also adds information, which might be important for telemetry or something else that like you queried that field and it failed. And that telemetry might still be worthwhile. So implementation is certainly, I think, the most important piece. Like, can this be built in a way that maintains one of our flagship principles of performance matters? And if that is true, then we're good. But I think the second one would be this like other thing that we've made sure that the information that we have is useful. Martin, I see your hand up.
Is it, and I don't want to sound negative again, but is it too late to do this? Like, from what I understand, this is mainly for clients that are going to use GraphQL 2 to emulate the new error behavior. And then what we're saying is we add new constraints on the servers so that they do not add the errors after propagation, so that the client can reconstruct the error afterwards. And if we need to change the server, we might as well just go to the new error propagation. Why do we need this?
It's a good
I don't
question.
know if I don't know if it's clear.
It is a good question. I think what it comes down to is I am not under the impression that we will have 100% adoption of no error propagation in 10 years' time. That requires a lot of like server-side adoption as well as client-side adoption. Whereas the throw-on error pattern is something that we already want and we're already using in the wild, even without the change in error propagation. You can see it in use in Relay, for example. So it's already something that people want. And even if we never land the change in error propagation, this is still a useful, like the throw on error behavior, I think, is how errors should be handled in modern GraphQL.
But not Now what we're saying is if we want to do this 100% correctly, we need to change the server so that as a client can reconstruct the correct error.
Yeah, in all honesty, it doesn't matter that much. It's a nice to have in terms of accuracy. But at the moment, what most people do if there's an error is they just ignore the whole response. I don't know anyone who sees a null in a position on the document and then goes to the root errors array and then walks it to find out which error relates to that path. It's just too hard to do. So having anything that throws there is better than nothing. But if we can also, at the same time that we're pushing this, also make the steps so that the next major version of the GraphQL library that you're using, and keep in mind, this is only the implementations that would be handling this, right? It's like an optimization where it says in the spec that you can cancel fields. This is kind of the same thing. You can also cancel their errors. So it doesn't actually need that much for people to start benefiting from it. It's not every single instance of GraphQL in the world needs it. It's just the implementations.
This is a good challenge though, right? Because it's ultimately boils down to, is the juice worth the squeeze? Do we, how much value will we get? So to Martin's point, there's a narrower slice of audience here if we expect that, you know, most people who are at the bleeding edge are going to shift to a no error propagation, smarter management of errors strategy. And then there will be some category of people who are forever lost in the past and are on some like 2014 version of GraphQL and will never update ever. And then there's like the slice in the middle who, for whatever reason, are stuck with a slightly older version of GraphQL or just like don't have the priority to push it forward and want to get a little bit better. That's great. But then considering that this is like maybe non-trivial to like check some state to figure out if you're allowed to add an error or not. Plus there may be like trade-off and there's of like, does this affect my telemetry or not? And I'm trying to think what we get for it. The thing that we get is for a tool like GraphQL Toe, when you read a field which should throw, we want to know which error is actually the error that should be thrown. But could that just be like a composite error? It's just like GraphQL error. And it's like, oh, GraphQL error, what kind of GraphQL error? And you got like reasons and it's like an array and then it has errors in it. Because the same is true that it's you know, field A died and field B died. Those are both non-nullable. Both of them would have bubbled. Both of them did bubble. And so you've got now a null. You read through and you realize, oh, below this path, there's two errors. Should you throw A or should you throw B? Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe you just do the last one wins. Maybe you do the first one. They both throw, so your error behavior is going to be roughly similar. It would actually be more technically correct to say you throw a composite error, which says multiple errors occurred, and these two are both non-nullable, and therefore this thing is null. And so I don't know, I might make the case it's like it is not super technically correct, but if you had field A, which is non-nullable and throws, and field C, which is nullable, but also through. So C didn't propagate, but A did. And now you've got the root node that has been canceled out. It would be technically more accurate to rethrow error A because that is the reason why that thing has become null. But it's also probably like not that crazy to say throw because of GraphQL composite error. You actually encountered two errors while evaluating this thing, and some of them, one of them plausibly propagated, and now you're in this state. So I guess like, is the juice worth the squeeze boils down to, is differentiating between these two cases important enough for the most common application developer in this cohort, such that like we should go and fix all of the GraphQL services to support it?
Yeah, it's a good question. And like, as we say, if we adopt the new no error propagation, this isn't an issue.
Yeah.
We just throw the correct error, and that is the one we throw, which is great. But if we what I think we should be trying to do is making it so that when people build applications now, that later they want to be able to turn error propagation off for, but they can't currently because, you know, the backend engineers don't want to upgrade to the latest version of GraphQL or whatever.
Yeah.
They shouldn't need to migrate their code later to handle the new, you know, the future case. Ideally, they should just write the code now because the same error that would have been thrown then is thrown now, essentially. That said, if they handle the aggregate case now, later the aggregate case just goes away. So it just means that these people, we're making them do a little bit more work than they would need to if they turned off error propagation. So I'm okay with it. It just felt like by putting the word should and like one sentence in the spec, and if we can execute it, then it would actually, you know, then we can just be accurate and we can, this is the one that blew up the selection set. This is the one you should throw. We can handle that complexity for the user rather than handing it down to every single GraphQL adopter to say, hey, you have to solve this on your own. Sorry. Sometimes it will be an aggregate. Sometimes it's just going to be a single error. We don't know. Also, if you wait a moment to read it, maybe it'll be something different. So yeah, at the end of the day, it's not super important, and we can let them pass a Boolean as well, like to choose what behavior they want.
I think it's interesting. I think probably the framing that we should be thinking about this is that migration path, which it may be that we don't need too much of a migration path, in which case this is not super necessary, or we're realizing that the migration path will be quite difficult, in which case we come back to this idea as like a path. My intuition is telling me that this is probably not going to be that important as part of, like, if you get the vast majority of cases where you're doing error handling, it's just like, there was an error, I threw it away. Like, I mean, to your point before, right? Like, right now, if any error happened anywhere in the entire response, you're like, I can't trust this response, and they throw the whole thing away and maybe try again. And GraphQL throw on error at least says, like, you can at least trust the vast majority of the response that you got. You can only ignore the parts that failed. That's a massive improvement. And I don't know, I would be surprised to find folks looking at it and saying, like, actually, not only do I need to catch and handle this error, I need to carefully look at exactly which error it was so that I can, like, appropriately do the right thing in the front end. And if that is the case, like, it doesn't seem that wild to say, here's a composite error, here are all the errors below. Application code, you can decide which of those is most important and do the right thing, which is different from what would happen in like a React throw an error and use an error boundary. You would get the first one that got read, which isn't necessarily better. I don't know. That's just like coincidental. It might be just higher up in the UI tree is like a less important field, which happened to die first. And the one that you actually like really wanted to say, you know, if that one down there dies, then I really want to make sure that this error is like about that. I don't, like it's gonna be work either way, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. And where you would care about the specific error codes is probably going to be mutations, and those are going to be thrown from the mutation field itself, so that doesn't suffer from this issue.
Totally.
Everything else is like something went wrong on the back end, sorry. So yeah. Okay, cool. I'm happy with that.
Should we talk about remove fragment spread name from visited?
Yes. Okay, so this is an interesting one. At the moment in GraphQL, in the spec itself, we talk about walking through the fragment spreads, and we track the ones that we visited, and we do that in such a way that we don't visit the same fragment again at the same level. Now, what that means is if different fragments have different directives, that becomes more interesting. So for example, if you have a fragment spread that has @defer, and then afterwards you have a fragment spread that doesn't have @defer, you don't necessarily know that you shouldn't be deferring this because not all of the fragment spreads have defer. Obviously, Stream and Defer have had to handle this themselves. And similarly, there was an issue with fragment arguments where because we only track the name, you might visit the same fragment more than once, but it might have different arguments, and we would only capture like the first time, which I believe when Matt first wrote it, he handled through like a signature based on the relay pattern of effectively doing a signature of what it is and then tracking that. What I am proposing in this pull request, and this is more than anything, this is just for discussion, is that singular line, which removes the fact that we visited it, so that when you go into the next iteration of the loop, you visit it again. In addition to this, I think that we should very strongly add the non-normative note that says, by the way, you should memoize or cache or whatever you want to say the visit to the fragment. So if you visit the same fragment again with the exact same arguments, with the exact same directives, with the exact same whatever else, then you shouldn't reprocess it, like you've already handled it. But this is, as it stands, the simplest way of making those other problems go away at the potential cost of performance. How GraphQL.js handles this, I believe, is it essentially memoizes the visits.
Remove. Oh, interesting. I'm not sure if this changes the right way to do it, because then I feel like we either have because the visited fragments mechanism in that algorithm is purely there to implement memoization, right? And so I feel like we either have it, in which case we describe it in such a way that the memoization should work correctly, or we just like get rid of it altogether. Because it literally is like, if this fragment name is in visited fragments, skip it, continue to the next one. Otherwise, add it and then like do all the stuff. But if you add it and then do all the stuff and then remove it again, like why did you add it? I guess to avoid cycles?
It's for cycles, yeah, or at least that was my interpretation. But I mean, you wrote the spec, you tell me. But I assumed it was to avoid cycles deeper, revisiting one that you've already visited nested.
We have a validation rule that stops us from doing that.
Yes, we do, but the spec execution doesn't assume that validation is true, right? It has a whole bunch of handling of things that should have been checked by validation.
Yeah, fair enough. I feel like, okay, maybe this got past us in the how defer and stream would work. Most of the other places where we do this sort of memoization, field grouping is the other place, is we have a bunch of validations that say, like, say for fields. So for a given alias, all the fields for that alias or for response name have to have the same arguments, the same directives, because you want the ability to say, I can just arbitrarily pick the first one, and I know that I have not missed a directive and I have not missed an argument because I've already written my validation rule that says that must be true. Should we be doing the same thing for fragment spreads? Like if this fragment spread is deferred, then all fragment spreads that occur at that same level must also be deferred.
What about, I was going to say, what about inline fragments, but they don't have names. So actually that's not a problem. I think it would be problematic for defer, because essentially what we're doing with defer is we're trying to make it so that like a component in your application can say, hey, I don't need this avatar right now. You can just put a placeholder there for now, and then when the data for the avatar comes through, render it. But another position in the application might say, hey, I definitely need to render the avatar right now. And those will probably be the same, like they're rendering the same component at the end of the day. They need the same data. Maybe one's like in the big bear, one's in the side of a comment or whatever. So if we were to do this, it would complicate that pattern, because suddenly we can't reuse, like the component itself isn't the one that says defer me. It's the parent of it that says render the avatar component deferred or render it directly. So I think if we were to enforce that, we would be breaking one of the really critical patterns of componentization of GraphQL.
Yeah. I mean, we kind of don't have that already because if you in your fragment say, I want this alias with this field with these arguments, and then someone else in a parallel fragment that's used elsewhere in your application says, I also want that alias with this other field, we say, no, 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 you can't do that because you've now created an ambiguous query, and we say, sorry, modularization, you have to just go fix this. And the Relay crew and others have had great proposals on fragment modularization that allows you to nest them under a separate response name. But like I think I mean it wouldn't even be two paths. It would have to be like a recursive path. Because I'm trying to think of as you are collecting these fields and you encounter one that says defer, the first one says defer, the second one does not say defer. You hit the deferred one first and you go, oh, I need to add these to my side thing. Like these fields go into the defer thing. And then you hit another fragment that's not deferred. And now like you have duplicates, you have a whole bunch that you're going to defer and you have a whole bunch that you're actually not going to defer, but now you're going to hit the same field twice, once initially and then the second time deferred.
Yeah, so we don't do incremental delivery like that anymore. That was like what was originally the
Yeah.
case, and now we effectively do collection across all of the fragments, and we effectively color them. Here are the ones that are running now, here are the ones that are running later. And so if it's in a deferred fragment, but it's also in a non-deferred one, we just don't defer that field. We only defer the other fields that are only ever seen inside of a defer or a string.
That's interesting. Okay, I think this is complicated enough that rather than removing the memoization behavior and saying, by the way, you should probably memoize this, if it is possible for us to clearly articulate a observable memoization strategy, then it would be worthwhile to do it. The coloring strategy makes sense, especially if one of those colors wins. You know, it's like if you have the defer color, great, but if you have the defer color and the not deferred colored, it's not deferred, and it doesn't matter which order you receive them in. The colors will always mix such that not deferred ends up being the color.
Yeah,
Um,
that's what we do. Yeah.
actually this like visited fragments strategy still works. You just like you need an extra property. You need the color as part of this set, right?
Well, it essentially becomes rather than adding fragment spread name to the visited, you add like the fragment spread signature, because it's
Yeah.
whether or not it's got the defer on. Like if you visited it once with defer and once without defer, so be it. But this is this is a really important part of this applies to defer, but it also applies to like user directives, like at live, for example. You might say at live for something where you would execute it as normal, but also you want to extract the fact that this needs to then be fed updates later. And so we do need this like signature, I think, approach in general.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of this idea of coloring the field is durable. I know that at live is nowhere near as mature as defer and stream are. So if we're purely just talking about defer and stream as sort of the colors, then it works really well. I'm trying to think like if a field was marked as eager and then another one is marked as live, what happens there? Um, but you can imagine instead of the visited fragments being a set, it's a map, and the value of the map is the color of the fragment. It's like, was it deferred or not? And right now, the implication is like there's only one possible thing, which is not deferred because we haven't landed that change yet. So why bother with a map when all the keys are exactly the same or all the values are exactly the same value? That's the same thing as the set. So we have a set. But you can imagine pulling a set and saying, hey, what what was the signature or the color of the fragment that got visited here. And if it was not deferred, then you say like, okay, great, skip. Like that's the dominant color. If we visited a non-deferred fragment and we see another fragment, regardless of whether it's deferred or not, we know we can skip it. If the opposite order happens, we see one and we say like, oh, okay, mark that we visited this fragment. However, put the value of that map as it was deferred. And now if you hit another fragment, you can say like, um, if it is not deferred, then don't skip. You have to continue because you might need to go recolor fields. But otherwise, you can skip. Like if it's also deferred, like you already did that, you can skip it. I think that would work.
I think it works for the features we have currently proposed.
Yes. Which might be fine that we iterate our spec in the direction of the features we have today. And certainly I mean, if there's other ones that we can see very clearly on the horizon that where this just like clearly doesn't scale, then we should do it. But I'm hesitant to go all the way to just like toss out the implementation details of how memoization works and just put a note that says you should probably memorize this, because what will actually happen is like people will just copy what GraphQL.js does. That's fine. But this does, especially since we get like security reports about I wrote this query and it blew up memory, and like it, of all the things to make sure that we consider carefully, the collect fields memory blow up issue one seems probably pretty important.
Oh, 100%. Hard agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's one of my biggest concerns with doing fragment aliases is it allows for that kind of blow up, and
That's the reason why we haven't
yeah
gloriously pursued it before. Yeah.
Okay, this seems reasonable. So I will chat with Yakov and essentially say, I think this is the right way to go about it. I like the map. And to be honest, the map for now, it's just going to be a map of string to Boolean, right? Was it deferred? If yes, then the next time you see it, you need to process it again if it's not deferred this time. Yeah, that works for me. And it would be easy to adopt that into GraphQL.js as well. Cool. Okay, fantastic.
Sweet.
Thanks.
Do we have anything else? I know we bounced around a little bit. Service capabilities. Did you want to talk about that?
Oh yeah, let's do that. So the composite schemas working group are keen on service capabilities. It helps a lot with the signaling between subschemas and the gateway to indicate like even what features are supported and that kind of thing. So for them, everything that they do is SDL based, like they indicate stuff through the SDL. So for them, having a syntax for this is actually really important. So a temporary workaround they could do that I've proposed to them and they're not happy with is just put an @service directive on the schema. And they're like, no, which is fair enough. A document directive would be an interesting way of doing it, but this isn't really something that applies to the document. It applies to the service. So I think we should go ahead with a service syntax around this. I know you and I have discussed this a little bit before, so I'd just like to say where I'm currently at. I think it should be the service keyword. I think that's straightforward. I think it should then be curly braces, just like with schema. And then I think it should have capabilities as a key, because we want to allow space for future expansion of what we want to put on a service. Then curly braces again. And then I think it should be essentially what this wants to express as a map is essentially a string map. But I really, really don't want to have double quotes everywhere. I think that would look disgusting. And for something that we are adding with new syntax anyway, that will break all existing parsers anyway, I would like to encourage that we adopt a nicer syntax for this. So my proposal is essentially name.name dot name, dot name, dot name, however many times you like, colon, and then a string constant. So it wouldn't quite be reverse DNS, like we wouldn't be able to represent hyphens. It would be case sensitive, but we can still say it was inspired by reverse DNS. And I think the only major requirement that I would put on it is that there would be at least one dot. So it'd be name dot name and then any other number of dot names. One option is to just do name colon, which would of course fit very nicely into the current syntax, but I think that honestly scoping these is going to be really, really critical to it not just becoming a mess of people claiming top level keys. I would very much prefer that they're scoped. That said, I don't think they necessarily need to be scoped inside of org.graphql.blah. I think just graphql.blah is fine, apollo.blah, relay.blah, graphql.blah is totally fine. So that's what I would like to propose. And I haven't got this written anywhere. This is very much an off the cuff proposal, but I would like to know where people sit on that idea at the moment.
Yeah, part of me is thinking like, what is the minimum viable change here? Because we could certainly design out like a beautiful way to describe services, but I'm also quite wary of us like accidentally inventing a new version of TOML or YAML or any one of those. And one thought was, can we literally recycle input object schema or the input object grammar? It's like you want to do a map? Cool. We got a thing that doesn't map. It's but to your point, it is just a name. Keys have to be a name, which means we can't do dots.
The other thing is the value is optional, right? So for many things, we only want the key and we don't care about the value.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. So it's going to be a thing that doesn't look exactly like an input object. Yeah, this is an interesting proposal. A dot separated string of names and then an optional trailing value, like colon value that's optional or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm also thinking of we'll have this in the SDL, but we also want to have it in introspection, and those should be duals, which means how would this manifest in the introspection? And would we want it literally to be like each service capability is a array of strings? Like each name can be represented as a string and then they're dot separated, and so they're an array of strings. That seems annoying because you'd probably just want to do like a quick matching, which means you want to do it entirely as a string. But if it's a string, I guess there's plenty of other places where we say this is just a string and it's not the same as the grammar is more strict.
It's literally split on dot. There's not even really a grammar there. So yeah, I think just having it as the string would be fine. If we were to allow more complex grammar for this, then maybe we would need something more complex, but honestly, it's split on dot. And then after that, it's name, which is already understood.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised in the future if we have a similar sort of like dot operator kind of syntax in the grammar.
Yeah, maybe for splitting up mutations across not one massive namespace.
Yeah, or there was a proposal long ago to do more complicated aliasing where you could alias, foo colon bar dot baz, and you would reach down into an object to get its value. A slightly different thing we're talking about here, but anyway, yeah, I think that's interesting. I think we should also just in parallel have a version which is much simpler, which is just string. It's just a sequence of like you have a key, which is a string, and then optionally colon value, which is also a string, which is, yes, slightly annoying because in your SDL, you have to make sure that these are quoted, but it won't restrict. I don't know, maybe someone wants to put like a dash character in there, like maybe their company name is like something dash something, and they're annoyed that the name grammar doesn't include a dash, or something like that. Like I don't know, it's you can put those in URLs, like if someone's gonna take the Java standard, I do com dot my company's domain name for these, and I can't do it because my company's domain name has a character that's not a valid name character.
Yeah, but domains are case insensitive, so you just capitalize after the hyphen and you're done. So
But-
if this is case sensitive and domains are case insensitive,
But it's not
then
just
the
about casing,
hyphen.
because the colon is a literal character in the URL, right? Like if I have facebook.com and you have face-book.com, I can't safely remove the dash and capitalize the B. You'll go to my site instead of yours. Oh, it doesn't. Okay. Martine's correcting me. Then you can't put dashes in package names. That's funny. Okay.
Not in Java, maybe other languages, not in Java.
That's hilarious. Yeah, I think it's fine. Okay, it's ultimately just I think a balance between my lightly held preference is to aim for the simplest syntax that works, and having this sort of like dot notation just be a convention that GraphQL uses, and therefore hopefully others will use the same. But I'm not necessarily opposed to a different way to do this. I think dot separated name is like also pretty reasonable, but the constraints there is not necessarily a bad thing. It is nice that it's like it's going to be unambiguous. You're not going to put like random Unicode characters in there and do something crazy. I don't know who would do that, but I don't. Anything's possible.
It flows incredibly naturally out of the GraphQL syntax, and it means we don't need to like redefine like any validations on it or anything like that. And I think it also like enables much easier use in URLs without having to URL encode and like a whole bunch of other things that might be useful for this in future. I think having an unbounded thing would be, we would find a use case where we would be like, damn, I wish we'd constrained it. So I would rather start with the most constrained form that we possibly can, and then open it out later if we need to, rather than just allow anything and then we can never change it.
Yeah.
We could, with this syntax, right, we could also add quoted identifiers in future. And it would just be if you only use name.name, then you don't need quotes, but otherwise you do. And that's the thing we could add if we needed to.
That's interesting. That would imply that the name.name.name is actually just a grammar restriction on a string. That like the actual underlying data that this is representing is in fact a string value. It is just a constrained string that must fit this grammar, as opposed to saying it is some like like a JavaScript property access grammar or something where each thing being dotted is its own thing, its own parse node, which we would not want here. That would complicate introspection. That's not what we want. Nice commas. Yeah, should that be allowed? That's
yes. Why not? Well, Martin, what you raised there is an interesting point, and I think that would be that we should probably allow descriptions on the capabilities.
I kind of like Benoit's idea here that these keys are actually well-known URLs that point to the documentation that describes what they are. Maybe that's too cute, but I kind of like the idea. Yeah, it does specified by. It's a good parallel. I guess we could also always add specified bias for them, but I don't know. Part of the idea here is that these capabilities should be very lightweight, right? You should be able to say, "Do you have this capability?"
Yeah, and I think like the examples in this that I wrote into the chat are straightforward examples of that. Do you have fragment arguments? Do you allow document directives? Do you, etc.? Do you have the new error propagation behavior?
Yeah, I'm curious also how far we can push not having values, like if they're always all Boolean.
So there's a number of use cases that I've come up with where we do want values for this, and it's things like pointing to your WebSocket URL for when you're doing subscriptions, things like that, right? That are part of the service where you request it over HTTP, and then you want to indicate here are the other things you can do. For example, trusted documents. I would love to integrate trusted documents into this with an ability to say, hey, here is the method of trusted documents that we use, whether it's a hash or whether it's something else. Here is the registration URL that you need to submit your documents to. Here's the name of the secret in your secret store that you can use in order to sign that, in order to send it, right? There's loads and loads and loads of stuff like that that would just mean that the tooling around trusted documents can become so much more automatic that it doesn't become such a faff for people to set up, because everyone should be using trusted documents. Well, 98% of GraphQL users should be non-public APIs.
Yeah, okay, by that I was thinking of our original case was just a bunch of existence checks that you could do, but yeah, it seems well within reason that you could say, you know, if one of the things you want to express is I have the capability for you to connect to a WebSocket, the most obvious next answer is great. Where do I do that exactly? What URL? And having that be part of that introspection seems quite useful.
Yeah, and even from the original one, it's like, what's your default error behavior? Is it propagate, no propagate, or abort? That's the trinary option.
Yeah. The commas, the fact that, okay, since we were just talking about ignored characters, the dot separated strings, because you could also presumably do GraphQL dot enter indentation fragment arguments. Is that a thing that we want to support? I guess to your point, maybe why not? But also, like, if we want to look at this as a, you know, you don't have to quote it with strings if it follows this particular format, implies that it actually should have stringy kind of semantics, which don't have ignores in them.
I think we can just put a non-normative note in the spec that says you should not use ignored component symbols around this, but like syntactically, it should still be valid. Who's going to have this at the end of the day? It's going to be either people printing their schemas, in which case the schema printer should not output spaces or commas or anything else like that, or it's going to be the people who are writing the SDL. And if they are putting commas in their SDL, then that's their own problem. Like, I'm okay with that. This isn't something submitted on user queries.
Yeah.
If you are confusing people with this, you are doing it deliberately, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah, people did deliberately. It's also probably not crazy. Yeah, the non-normative note might be fine. Okay, either way, like I think you've got a direction here that works. and you've got a handful of alts in case you hit edge cases, so you should run with it.
Okay, sounds good. I will write up some proposal for that and then run it by the composite schemas working group. And if anyone else knows of anyone else that would like to add stuff here, because honestly, I see this being useful for so much stuff, please get in touch.
Awesome. Okay, folks, we'll wrap things up. I know it's getting late for all of you. I have to go feed myself. And this is a great discussion. I think we're super close on all the pieces that are getting added to the spec, and I'm excited about everything else. Nice work.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
See y'all.
Thank you.
See you.